Scott Cruz. He's from Clark Hill, employment and labor law attorney, and we're going to have Representative Kelly Cassidy up here to answer questions about the pending cannabis legislation. They have done a very good job of looping business in and saying, hey, what do you guys need on the floor, or how are you going to treat this, or zero drug policy and such. So that's what we're going to focus on today. Make sure if you have any questions or concerns, let us know. And Scott, if you could say a few things about yourself, and we'll get going.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Scott Cruz. I am a labor and employment attorney at a firm in Chicago called Clark Hill. Represent exclusively employers in their day-to-day operations and needs with their employees.
And first, right off the bat, what should employers be concerned about the legalization of cannabis in the workplace? What should they look out for?
Sure. So fortunately, we've had a head start on this already, right? Because there is, in Illinois, medicinal marijuana is already been legalized. So we've got at least a path in terms of how to handle this. And hopefully your employment policies within your handbooks discuss this. So some of the things that I think we need to be worried about, and not, first things first is that even if recreational marijuana is legalized, remember that under the federal law, marijuana is still illegal, right? So you can still have a zero tolerance policy. You can still have a drug-free workplace. You can still maintain and enforce policies that people cannot possess, people cannot use, people cannot be impaired by marijuana. So again, we've got this pathway already from the medicinal purposes in terms of how we should be reacting and how we should be responding. Now, until we actually see the final bill, in terms of what are the legal ramifications for that, that's one thing we'll have to talk about. And remember too, in the medicinal purposes, there's a caveat for a card holders, right? That says if you are a card holder, you cannot discriminate, you cannot take any adverse action, right? You cannot terminate, you cannot discipline somebody just for being a card holder. We don't know, at least I haven't seen the bill yet, whether or not that same carve-out is going to be for recreational type of marijuana. And if it is, it's going to be interesting to see how we can apply that. So I think that right there, for me, the most interesting aspect is they're going to have that same carve-out that the Medicinal Cannabis Act does.
In your opinion, what should employers ask for in a situation like this? Is it zero tolerance policy, or should they go even further, or what should they do to protect themselves?
Sure. Maintain a zero tolerance policy. I think you need to have that, right? We can't have people showing up to work possessing, distributing, using marijuana. We just simply cannot have that in any work environment, regardless of where we are. So maintain a zero tolerance policy, like I said, because what I put in my handbooks is a provision that says, even though that some states have legalized marijuana for medicinal and recreational purposes, because under federal law it is still illegal, under this policy it remains illegal. And the second aspect to that is how you define illegal drugs in your policy, and you should have a separate carve-out in your policy for how you're defining illegal drugs. And how I define it is any controlled substance, the possession of which is illegal, right? Because under federal law, marijuana is a Schedule I cannabis, and its possession of which is illegal. So I think those are the two ways in terms of how you protect yourself.
In the terms of when and if cannabis becomes legal, can you say it's been treated or should be treated like alcohol in the workplace as well?
It could be treated similarly, right? But remember, alcohol, federal government said, hey, you can drink alcohol, whereas federal government has not said here that you could use, possess, or come to work impaired. So generally in my policies, I have an alcohol and drug policy, right? Because if we do testing, if someone is impaired by either alcohol or if they're impaired by any controlled substance, it remains the same, right? Do you have reasonable suspicion? It's a for-cause test. Do you have reasonable suspicion to believe that someone is impaired, right, by either alcohol or some type of controlled substance? And then with that, then you can start having what I call a medical evaluation. So you can require somebody to undergo a medical evaluation, i.e. a drug test, to determine whether or not he or she is impaired. So you can treat them the same, But again, because the caveat being under federal law, marijuana is still illegal, there is that slight difference.
And it is my great pleasure to introduce Representative Kelly Cassidy, who's been doing a wonderful job on this issue, bringing stakeholders together over 2 years now, countless of meetings. Could you explain the protections for employers in the bill?
Absolutely. There it is, working. Absolutely. So when the medical program came into play, that law included the opportunity for employers to retain their drug-free workplace policies. And when we started to work on this bill, and as you said, it's been a couple of years now, and I joke that I'm very close to killing a car that was new at the beginning of this process, going all over to make sure that everyone that has an opinion gets to share it. There were some requests, you guys brought us some language, the chamber brought us some language to make sure that we're really clear on those protections, and that will remain in place. I will say what we are seeing around the country is competing court cases around, in particular as it applies to patients more so than just recreational users, but we're getting different decisions out of different circuits. And so to our mind, the best approach is to keep this in place while the courts sort that out. Some courts have sided with the employees, some courts have sided with the employers. It's going to take another couple of years before that's clear. One of the things I always do want to point out and make clear, as we've gone around and worked on this, whether we're talking about the issues of employers or we're talking about any of the other whole host of things that go into building this gigantic behemoth of a bill that we're putting together, we've looked in a lot of rearview mirrors. We've spent a lot of time. We have the benefit now of 9 different states with varying numbers of years behind them. And so we have sought to benefit from the lessons learned in each of those states, and we ask a lot of questions when we go into another state. What do you wish you had done differently? What do you wish you hadn't done? What do you wish you could have done? What has surprised you most? Colorado's biggest surprise was no change in their workers' comp costs or cases. None. Kind of amazing. But it's not really amazing, because the truth is all over the country, what we see post-legalization is usage rates stay pretty static. And so the reality of our experience, and here in Illinois, there's a federal survey done every year that tracks usage of various substances, and cannabis is one of them. Here in Illinois, 750,000 people report being a regular user, which means in the last month, of cannabis. We've got about 50,000 medical cards issued. Now, I don't know about y'all, but when you go to the doctor and he asks you about your drinking habits, you probably say you have a glass of wine with dinner. And in his head he goes, or 2, or 3. So we presume those numbers to be conservative, because this is self-reporting on something, as you say, still has that federal barrier on it. So, but if we just accept the 750,000, take away the 50,000 medical cards, that's 700,000 people today making regular use of this product. What we see in other states, usage rates stay pretty static. What we get a decrease in youth use that drops off, and if you do it right, it drops steadily off year over year. Colorado's got a really robust prevention program that gives us a lot to work with. And then you see a slight increase among people over 50, which always makes me kind of giggle too, because this is a demographic that's familiar with the product, tends to be a more law-abiding demographic.
Rob just turned 52, right?
Today? Happy birthday. Do your knees hurt? Because mine do. There you go. There you go. So that kind of it, like when I read that the first time, I was like, well, that makes all the sense in the world, that demographic it might come back to the product. But most people aren't going to wake up the day after this bill becomes law and decide to start using a product that's been readily available the entire time they were choosing not to use it. And so all of these things that we talk about, whether it's a workplace issue or a driving issue or pick one and go with it, it's happening today. and we aren't equipping ourselves to respond to it well. And this actually will allow us to take this product out of the shadows, ensure that the product that the people are buying is tested and regulated and packaged safely and securely, and sold not by the dude on my corner who I still say, I've been watching him, still hasn't carded anybody. Not yet. I mean, I think I've said it enough publicly that, like, he might throw me a bone and, like, pretend to card somebody, you know? So we are able to better control the product if we put it into a regulated marketplace and acknowledge that it's already happening all around us. You know, we hear from studies of youth that 87% of teens say that cannabis is much more easily accessible to them than alcohol. We're not going to cut off all access, just as we haven't cut off all access to alcohol, but we can make it harder.
In your experience with the, what are the issues that pop up with workers' comp and unemployment insurance in this area, and what should employers be concerned about or not concerned about when it comes to this?
Sure. Fortunately for unemployment, it's not really going to be affected at all. Under the definition of, so someone files an and then you have an opportunity to file a protest. You've got 10 days to do that. Within that form, there's a box that says, do you wish to protest for what's called deliberate and willful misconduct? A couple years ago, that definition was expanded. That definition was expanded to about 10 different types of subparts of what deliberate and willful misconduct actually means. And 2 of those subparts says, if you come to work, essentially, deliberate and willful misconduct also includes if you come to work essentially high or impaired by a controlled substance. And deliberate and willful misconduct also includes if you are using a controlled or possession of a controlled substance. So for unemployment purposes, if you are terminating someone for possessing, for using, for being impaired at work, it's not going to change for unemployment. They can still file it, you can protest, you would check the box for those 2 claims, and you should win that claim. For workers' comp purposes, I think the big issue there is going to be how are your third-party carriers going to deal with this, right? Because now there may be additional claims, and are your insurance companies going to start paying for this, right? Someone who says that I am out, let's say they have cancer, unfortunately, right? And they say that the treatment the doctor has is me smoking marijuana, right? An employer says, well, I don't want to be complicit in this individual smoking marijuana, complicit because under federal law, it's still illegal. And now I am an enabler, right? I'm not saying that I am, but an enabler in terms of I'm being complicit in helping this individual smoke marijuana, which I don't agree that I don't, but the employer doesn't agree, right? So I think that's the big issue in terms of how employers who take a hardcore stance and say, hey, I don't believe that recreational marijuana or medicinal marijuana should be legal. Do I have to pay for my employee's treatment when this is the treatment that the doctor is recommending? So I think that
there's no insurance coverage at all. It's not contemplated anytime soon. There's no insurance coverage for medical cannabis under current law, okay. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. In fact, a lot of the industry folks, in particular as you deal with veterans, they're setting up their own charitable wings to be able to help folks with the cost of the medicine. Because you do find this situation where you're choosing between something that you have like a $20 copay on versus something that's going to cost you a couple $100. But there's no contemplation of insurance coverage anytime soon, okay. Really anywhere in the country.
Okay.
In your research for crafting a bill and your discussions, what have employees said in different states such as Colorado and everything? Are they more likely or less likely to use than go to work? How long does it take to get out of the system? And what protections that you guys come to for employers in the Illinois bill?
So the reality is, one of the few things we've heard, in particular out of states like Colorado, where they've got a much longer track record, employers are deciding to stop testing for cannabis, in particular in the pre-employment screening, because I learned a new phrase out in Colorado, dangerously low unemployment. I didn't know it was a thing, but it's a thing. They have more jobs than people. And so it really hasn't become, again, let's go back to that 700,000 people. Like, it's happening here, we're dealing with it now, or we're not dealing with it now. But there's not really been a lot of movement around, what do I do to, how long does it take to get out of my system? Because it's a very dynamic substance. It's different in everyone. And ironically enough, it's worse for women than for men in terms of false positives because we carry more fatty tissue, and that's where THC is stored. So women actually end up with more false positives than men. But, from the employer perspective, the one thing I have heard is that, ordering a 6-panel test instead of a 7-panel test is something that people do to sort of get around, deal with it.
And just to cut, so New York recently, actually, the city council just passed a bill there that they have barred employers from actually testing for THC for job applicants, right? So I don't know if that's something that is going to be in the bill or not, but that's something New York has done in terms of just saying, hey, employers, private and public, you cannot, for your ongoing onboarding process, you cannot test applicants for THC, right? So they can't even test them for that.
That's not going to be in this bill. It's not going to be in any bill I carry anytime soon. My commitment from the start to employers has been to make sure that that ability to maintain a drug-free workplace policy remains intact.
Does anybody have any questions or concerns that we could answer? Yes, sir.
I got one question. Any idea if they're going to legalize marijuana in Illinois?
Hopefully very soon. I've spent the last 2.5 years working on this bill that we anticipate having language to share pretty soon. And by the end of May is my goal to pass the bill. Now, what that means functionally is that then we need some rulemaking time, so about 6 months of rulemaking time. The best case scenario is to market by January 1 of 2020. So first legal sales would be January 1 of 2020. If, as we say in the South, good Lord willing and the creek don't rise, we'll get there.
Will we open up more retailers?
Yep.
I mean, you can set a license.
So there will be, you're right, I can do a little bit on this, I don't want to take away from your time too, but so right now there are only 2 classes of licenses in the medical cannabis industry. So you've got dispensaries, which is essentially the retailer, and cultivation centers, which they are the growers, the processors, and the distributors, the transporters. So we want to add some layers of licensing to allow for a few more entry points into the marketplace. So we obviously are going to need more dispensaries. So we need more retail access. Right now there are only 55 operational dispensaries in the state. So if you just imagine, I don't like thinking about what January 1, 2020 would look like with 55 retail outlets. So that will ramp up more quickly than some of the other categories. And then based on demand, the departments that administer them will be able to let more licenses out. So you'll see more retail licenses coming out more quickly than, say, the big cultivation centers. I don't know if anybody lives in an area with a big cultivator, but they're huge. They're massive operations. So the other categories of licensing we're contemplating introducing is a craft grow, a smaller footprint grow that has a lower capital need to open up. And really, because they're smaller, they're not going to be as smelly, because they smell, frankly. Doesn't matter how much you like the smell of cannabis, that's a lot. So the smaller ones, if you imagine sort of some of these shuttered manufacturing districts that we see around the state, that's my vision. I've been in one of these smaller buildings. So that would be a smaller canopy of 3 to 12,000 square feet canopy, where some of these others, the big ones, can be up to 100,000 square feet of canopy space. And then a processor, which is going to allow for a lot more innovation in the marketplace. Right now, the only way to create an infused product or a delivery method is to be part of a cultivation center, because that's where they get made. So your grandmother's brownies might be the best brownie recipe ever, but unless you are working with a cultivator, you don't get to infuse your brownies and bring them to market. So we're creating a processor license to allow for a lot more innovation and entrepreneurship in the industry. I see you, 1 second. And then there'll be a transport license to allow folks to move the product between the cultivation center, the processor, the dispensaries, and to move the money for them. So those are the additional layers of licensing. Yes?
Just two things. Number one, on this medical marijuana, what, if any, restrictions are where they can lay up? Are they public place?
No, there's no public usage allowed.
Parking lot? Or
Nope.
And secondly,
And some jurisdictions have started, you know, like cigar clubs kind of things. Some jurisdictions in other states have created social use venues. We're not really contemplating that at this point, but it is something to put in the back of your mind so that it's not just at home. In particular, Nevada is struggling with their tourism industry around this. People go, they purchase, they can't smoke in their hotel rooms. You know, that's one of the reasons people contemplate it.
In relation to the sort of follow-up to that, in relation to the medical marijuana, a possibility of there being an exemption, would they be allowed to use on premise of an employer or within a car or anything like that? Or
So public use is prohibited. It's really that simple. And I think that within the, and we also need to keep in mind, we're not really dealing with your Uncle Lou's cannabis in a film canister anymore. You know, people, a vape is indistinguishable from a nicotine vape. Edibles, you don't know if I'm sucking on a mint or taking my medicine. So there are other, I mean, I've even seen an asthma inhaler. Kind of fascinating, all the different things that happen. So, but again, back to the drug-free workplace.
And can I follow?
outside of the revenue stream that we want to create, what's the upside to having people in a mind-altering state that impairs their judgment?
So the reality is they're in that mind-altered state right now on a product that isn't regulated. It is not, it's supporting cartels and street gangs, and we're not able. No. We want to put this through a licensed process.
They're not going away.
Actually, in Colorado, 75% of their street market has disappeared. If you do it right, and in particular, you talked about the revenue. If you go for revenue first, you end up with less revenue. If you do it for the money, you get less money. You can't overtax this product. It's critically important that we don't look at this as a magic ATM machine, because it isn't. First of all, I mean, the revenue estimates are $350 to $700 million. That's real money, but it's certainly not going to solve all of our problems. And so the reality is other states started out with, you know, crazy high taxes, 30, 40, 50%. And people aren't going to break up with their dealer over that.
yeah. We had a question over here. Sorry.
If the state legalizes it, do the cities and villages still have to opt in, or
It's an opt-out.
it's not that?
Yep.
Yeah, how was the 75% reduction in the street seller, how was that measured, and what valid or validity was with that?
That comes from Colorado law enforcement.
How did they validate that? I'd like to know that. How was that validated?
This is the state of Colorado's data on arrests and on the existence of open-air street markets.
That's huge.
It is.
We have a question over here.
So just curious, with alcohol, there's a defined level of impairment. Now, everyone's a little bit different, right? But there's 0.08 defines impairment. Is there one? I've never heard of one. Is there one for marijuana? And what? How do you test? How does it work?
So there are lots of different ways to test for it. Start from the primary assumption that exists in DUI law, which is impairment is impairment. So if you're exhibiting signs of impairment, that's admissible, you're impaired. What we use here in Illinois is a standard that we set back in 2015 or 2016 that relates to the presence of THC in blood or saliva because we allowed a cheek swab test. They're piloting that in Carroll Stream. Michigan has actually done great work on this and are way ahead of the rest of the world, or the rest of the country anyway, on piloting new methods. So just as it took us quite some time to actually land on 0.08, it's going to take us a little time to get to the right number on this as well. Right now we're at 5 and 10 just nanograms per deciliter, depending on blood or saliva. Some studies have shown that the most reliable is as high as 25. One of the things we want to make sure we do, because this is such a dynamic part of the science on this is changing so quickly, we want to pick from what Michigan did and make sure that we put in place, they've assembled a panel that will be, that's impaneled to follow the science, make recommendations to the legislature, and keep up on that.
And also keep in mind that as we pointed out before and that she's helped us with and Scott has pointed out, for workplace policy, it doesn't matter how much is in a blood level. If they, yeah,
Zero tolerance,
that's right.
regardless, then.
Yep.
That's right.
Right. So it's you as an employer have to make that decision in terms of, do you believe that someone is reasonably impaired, right? The test, the urine test is just going to show, is there THC in the system, right? Saliva, blood may show in terms of the more immediacy of the use. But you as an employer, when you have a zero tolerance drug policy, you can make that determination. If you send me to have a drug test, it comes back as positive, you can say, well, zero tolerance regardless of when you used it, right? If at home 5 days ago or on your lunch break, we have a zero tolerance policy. If you choose to terminate that individual, legally you can do that.
We have time for 2 more questions. Right here at the microphone, then we got you.
So we have 4 truck drivers. So again, you hit something.
That CDL thing stays in place, federal law, they're out of luck.
So we test. We get rid of them, right? We won't get sued or workers' comp and a whole thing.
There are those federal requirements related to their CDL, so nothing about this is, nothing's going to change for you. Yeah, nothing's going to change for you.
The transportation industry, the healthcare industry, there's rules that say it's zero, you can't, you have to test. You can't have any trace of it whatsoever.
Our policy about alcohol, same thing.
Correct.
Last question here.
Thank you so much. John Milner is a good friend of mine. He's the lobbyist for the Police Chiefs Association, and I'm a big supporter of law enforcement. They are just so against legalizing marijuana in Illinois, and I know Bob Berlin, our DuPage County State's Attorney, is a big law enforcement guy too, and he said that he disagrees with the concept that this is going to reduce crime, and it's just a panacea of trying to get more money for the state. So I think it's an overall horrible thing, and it's very negative to have recreational marijuana in the state of Illinois. So I felt a need to say that.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for your time and consideration. And
Thanks, everybody.
Please
And I'm
thank
so
Representative
sorry I
Everett
was late.
and Scott Cruz.
For watching the Illinois Channel. You may also wish to follow us online, where you are free to make comments or program suggestions. Get our breaking news updates on Twitter, where you can find us at Illinois Channel. You can find our past programming on YouTube at youtube.com/Illinois Channel TV. Or you can go to the Illinois Channel website at illinoischannel.org. There you can find not only our current video stories and programs, but also our library of past programs, as well as articles that provide additional information about Illinois issues and individuals. The Illinois Channel, keeping you connected to your state, your issues, your home.